My husband's family called me just a waitress and threw me out on Christmas. 3 years later, I bought their company. My name is Eleanor Marsh, and for 6 years I was married into a family that never once let me forget where I came from. I want to start this story the way it actually started. Not with the betrayal, not with the money, but with a dinner table. Because if you understand that dinner table, you'll understand everything that came after it. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat with my mother, who worked double shifts as a hospital aide, and my younger brother Theo, who has autism and needed more care than our household income ever comfortably allowed. I started waitressing at 16 at a mid-range steakhouse called Corrigan's because the tips were decent and the schedule worked around school. I waitressed all through community college, then through my transfer to State University, then through the 2 years after graduation when the marketing jobs I applied for kept going to candidates with unpaid internships on their resumes. Internships I couldn't afford to take because unpaid work doesn't pay rent. I met Nathaniel Voss at Corrigan's on a Tuesday night in October. He was 29, dressed like money before you even saw the watch, and dining alone at a four-top because his business dinner had cancelled. I remember exactly what he ordered because I've replayed that night in my head more times than I'd like to admit. The bone-in ribeye, medium rare, and a glass of Malbec he sent back once because it wasn't breathing right, which at the time I thought was pretentious and now, in hindsight, tells you everything you need to know about how the Voss family relates to the world. Everything has to perform correctly for them, including wine, including companies, including, eventually, me. He came back the following Tuesday. And the Tuesday after that. By the 4th week, he asked for my number instead of the check, and I remember laughing and writing it on the receipt anyway, because even then some instinct in me knew this was a story I'd want to remember precisely. Nathaniel's family owned Voss Industrial Solutions, a 3-generation manufacturing and industrial supply company with contracts across 4 states and a name that meant something in rooms I had never been allowed into. His father, Harold Voss, had built the company's modern iteration from his own father's smaller regional operation. His mother, Constance Voss, ran the family's social calendar with the precision of a military logistics officer. His older sister, Whitney, worked in the company's marketing department, a fact that will matter a great deal later in this story, and had never once in 6 years learned to pronounce my name correctly, despite saying it wrong in a way that always sounded deliberate. I want to be fair here because I tried to be fair even now. Nathaniel, for the first 2 years, was kind to me in a way that felt real. He defended me, quietly, privately, when his mother made comments. He told me on our wedding night that marrying me was the only decision he'd ever made entirely for himself, without his family's approval baked in. I believed him. I think for a while it was even true. But here is the dinner table I promised you. It was our second Thanksgiving as a married couple at the Voss family estate. And yes, I'm going to keep calling it an estate because that's genuinely what it was. A 9-bedroom colonial on 11 acres with a name carved into a stone gate, Ashford House, like it was a character in its own story. Constance had seated me at the far end of the table near the children's section, despite the fact that I was 28 years old and married to her son. When I mentioned trying to make conversation, that I'd once worked a Thanksgiving shift at Corrigan's and the tips had been extraordinary, because people feel generous on holidays, the table went quiet in that particular way rich rooms go quiet, not shocked, just faintly embarrassed on my behalf, the way you'd feel if someone brought up a medical condition at the wrong moment. Whitney was the one who broke the silence. She smiled. She always smiled when she was being cruel, I learned that early, and said, "It's so sweet that you're not embarrassed about that kind of work. Most people would be." I said, "Why would I be embarrassed? I paid my way through school with that job." And Harold, at the head of the table, not even looking up from carving the turkey, said, "Of course, dear, not everyone has the luxury of a different path." The luxury of a different path. I've thought about that phrase more than almost anything else anyone in that family ever said to me, because it wasn't really an insult about waitressing. It was a statement of belief. What I did, no matter how many years I spent building a life alongside their intelligence or I would always be, in their eyes, luxury, a woman who had been given the wrong starting position in a race they assumed I could never actually win. I didn't say anything else that night. I finished my dinner. I helped clear the table because that's who I am, and I always noticed, that no one else helped clear the table with me. I want to give you a few more scenes from those early years, because I think a single dinner, however sharp, doesn't fully capture the texture of what 6 years of this actually felt like. It wasn't one dramatic cruelty, it was 100 small ones, delivered so casually that objecting to any single one of them would have made me look thin-skinned, when really it was the accumulation that wore a person down. There was the time in our first year of marriage when Constance hired a stylist to help me dress more appropriately for a charity gala and handed me a list, an actual printed list, of designers she considered acceptable, as though my closet were a liability the family needed to manage rather than a matter of my own taste. There was the time Harold introduced me to a business associate at a golf club dinner. As Nathaniel's wife, she used to be in the service industry, in a tone that made service industry sound like a euphemism for something slightly disreputable, rather than the honest, difficult work it actually was. There was the time Whitney jokingly asked at my own bridal shower whether I'd read up on wine pairings yet, in front of 20 of her friends, none of whom I knew, all of whom laughed the specific laugh of people performing loyalty to whoever holds more power in the room. I absorbed all of it. I told myself for years that this was simply the tax you paid for marrying into a different world, that eventually, if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, proved myself capable enough, the condescension would fade. I want to say clearly, for anyone listening who is currently telling themselves the same story, it doesn't fade. Contempt rooted in someone's need to feel superior doesn't respond to your achievements. If anything, in my experience, it hardens around them, because your achievements become a threat to the hierarchy they've built their entire self-image on. That was Thanksgiving, and 100 smaller Thanksgivings besides it. Christmas, 4 years later, is where the story really begins. Before I tell you about that Christmas, I need to tell you what I'd spent those 6 years actually doing, because the Voss family made one critical, expensive mistake. They never bothered to ask. After Nathaniel and I married, I didn't stop working. I know some versions of this story involve a woman who gives up her career for a wealthy husband's family and later regrets it. That's not what happened to me, and it's the single most important decision I made in that entire marriage. I took a junior marketing coordinator position at a small regional logistics firm called Bramwell Freight, a company you've never heard of, which is exactly the point. It was unglamorous. It paid modestly. Constance once asked at a dinner party in front of 6 of her friends whether I still did that little job, and I said yes, brightly, and let her assume it was something she could safely ignore. Here's what she didn't know, because she never asked a single follow-up question in 6 years. Bramwell Freight, when I joined it, was a struggling 40-person operation that specialised in last-mile logistics for mid-sized manufacturers. I didn't just do their marketing. Within 18 months, the owner, a sharp, exhausted man named Desmond Okafor, who'd inherited the company from his father and was drowning in operational inefficiency, promoted me to Director of Growth Strategy because I'd rebuilt his entire client acquisition pipeline and had doubled his contract volume using techniques I'd taught myself from library books and free online courses during years when I couldn't afford business school. By year 3 of my marriage, I wasn't just an employee at Bramwell. Desmond, recognising what I'd done for the company and unable to match my market value and salary alone, offered me equity. 12%, vesting over 4 years, in exchange for staying on and continuing to run growth strategy. I said yes immediately. I told no one in the Voss family, not because I was hiding something shameful, because I had learned painfully that anything good in my life that came from that little job would be minimised, questioned, or quietly credited to luck the moment I mentioned it. By year 5, Bramwell Freight had grown from 40 employees to over 300, expanded into 2 new states, and become one of the most efficient regional logistics operations in our part of the country. My 12% equity stake, once functionally worthless, was now conservatively valued at just under $4 million, based on an acquisition offer Desmond had quietly received and turned down the year before. I want you to sit with that number for a moment because you're going to need it later. $4 million in equity, built entirely by the Waitress, entirely outside the Voss family's awareness, entirely because I refused to let their contempt define what I was capable of. Let me tell you a little about how that growth actually happened, because I think the mechanics matter, and because I want you to understand this wasn't luck or timing. It was a specific, deliberate set of decisions repeated patiently over years. When I joined Bramwell, the company was losing clients faster than it was gaining them, largely because its sales process was built entirely on cold outreach and word of mouth, with no real strategy behind either. I spent my first 3 months simply listening, sitting in on sales calls, reading every client complaint email from the past 2 years, mapping out exactly where prospective clients dropped out of the pipeline and why. What I found was almost embarrassingly simple. Bramwell's quoting process took, on average, 11 business days, while their 2 largest regional competitors had automated systems that could turn around a quote in under 24 hours. Clients weren't leaving because Bramwell's service was bad. They were leaving because by the time Bramwell responded, the client had already signed with someone faster. I rebuilt that quoting pipeline myself over a single brutal month, teaching myself the necessary software through trial, error, and a stack of library books I read on breaks between waitressing shifts. I was, at that point, still occasionally picking up at Corrigan's on weekends because Nathaniel and I hadn't yet fully merged our finances, and I wanted my own cushion, separate from his family's world, just in case. Once the quoting turnaround dropped to under 2 days, client retention improved almost immediately. A new client acquisition followed within 2 quarters. Desmond noticed. Desmond, to his enormous credit, was the kind of owner who recognised competence regardless of where it came from, and who never once in 5 years of working alongside me asked about my family, my education pedigree, or my husband's last name. He cared about results, and I gave him results, quarter after quarter, until the 12% equity offer arrived not as an act of generosity, but as a straightforward business decision. Retaining me had become more valuable to the company than the equity itself. By year 4, I'd built out an entire growth strategy division under me. 6 analysts, 2 account strategists, a data specialist I'd personally recruited away from a much larger firm, using nothing but the strength of Bramwell's genuinely improving trajectory as a pitch. I ran quarterly board presentations. I negotiated directly with clients whose annual contracts were worth more than the entire Voss family's charitable foundation distributed in a typical year. And I did every bit of it while going home most evenings to a family that still, when they thought of me at all, thought of a girl carrying plates at Corrigan's. I also want to tell you about my brother Theo, because he matters to this story too. As Bramwell grew and my income grew alongside it, not through Nathaniel's money, through my own, which I kept meticulously separate in accounts under my maiden name, a decision my mother had actually advised me to make on my wedding day, quietly, in the bathroom of the venue, and I am more grateful for that advice than almost any other I've received. I was able to move Theo and my mother into a better apartment, hire a part-time aide to help with his care, and eventually put a modest down payment on a small house for them, entirely on my own, without a single dollar of Voss money touching it. Nathaniel knew, broadly, that I was doing well at work. He was proud of me, in the distracted way successful men from families like his are often proud of their wives. A pat on the head disguised as a compliment. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was the actual scale of it. And the reason he didn't know is that somewhere around year 4 of our marriage, I had stopped talking about my career at Voss family gatherings entirely, because I had learned that my success made them uncomfortable in a way my waitressing never had. A poor woman marrying into money is a story they understood. A woman quietly building more wealth than their son's own trust fund distributions was a story that threatened the entire I should have paid closer attention of how to they that saw themselves. It was, in retrospect, a warning. I'm not going to pretend the marriage was purely a victim narrative, with Nathaniel as an innocent bystander to his family's cruelty. That would be dishonest, and this story only works if I'm honest with you. By year 5, Nathaniel had changed. Some of it was his family's doing. Harold had begun grooming him more aggressively to take over Voss Industrial Solutions, and the pressure of proving himself worthy of an inheritance he'd been handed at birth seemed to sharpen every insecure edge he had. Some of it was simply who he'd always been underneath the parts I'd chosen to see. He started missing dinners for board prep. He started taking calls at strange hours, stepping into the hallway, lowering his voice in a way he never used to. When I asked, he said it was stress about the company. Voss Industrial Solutions had lost 2 major contracts that year, and Harold was putting enormous pressure on Nathaniel to fix it before he'd officially hand over the CEO title. I believed him because I had no specific reason not to, and because I was, frankly, busy building my own success and hadn't yet learned to apply my professional instincts. The instincts that had let me spot inefficiency in a company's operations from across a room, to my own marriage. The affair, when I eventually pieced it together, had been going on for roughly 10 months. Her name was Sabrina Holloway, and she was, of all things, a junior associate at the law firm that handled Voss Industrial Solutions contracts. I want to tell you exactly how I found out, because it's a smaller, quieter discovery than you might expect from a story like this. And I think that's actually more common than the dramatic reveals you see in movies. It was a parking receipt. Nathaniel had told me he was in Albany for a supplier meeting on a Thursday. 3 days later, doing laundry, I found a valet parking stub in his jacket pocket from a restaurant 14 minutes from our house, timestamped the same Thursday evening at 7:52 p.m., a time when, according to him, he was still 200 miles away at a hotel bar with a supplier named Greg. I didn't confront him immediately. This will sound familiar if you know the pattern of these stories, and I make no apology for following it because it's the correct pattern. When you suspect betrayal in a marriage tangled up with money, family business, and years of quiet condescension, the worst thing you can do is react before you understand the full shape of what you're dealing with. I had learned this from 6 years of business strategy. Emotion is expensive, information is leverage. I chose leverage. Over the following 2 months, quietly, I confirmed the affair through methods I won't detail extensively here, but which any competent private investigator could replicate. Financial records, a pattern of business trips that didn't correspond to any actual business Voss Industrial Solutions was conducting, and eventually, a conversation I overheard by accident that removed all doubt. But here's what I found that mattered far more than the affair itself, and this is the pivot point of the entire story. While investigating the affair, I discovered that Voss Industrial Solutions was in far worse financial condition than the family had let on to anyone, including apparently most of their own board. I need to explain this carefully because it's the mechanism that made everything else in this story possible. Voss Industrial Solutions had lost its 2 largest manufacturing contracts 18 months prior. Contracts that together accounted for nearly 40% of the company's annual revenue. Harold had covered the shortfall with a combination of a business line of credit, a second mortgage on 2 of the company's warehouse properties, and, this is the part that stunned me, a private loan from an outside investment group called Corrigan Capital Partners, secured against a meaningful percentage of the company's equity. I remember staring at that name, Corrigan Capital Partners, for a long time when I first found it in documents Nathaniel had left unsecured in a home office drawer. He clearly assumed I'd never think to look through, because women who used to work at Corrigan's apparently weren't expected to recognize the name of an investment firm sharing it. It wasn't the same Corrigan, obviously, pure coincidence, but I remember thinking, almost laughing despite everything, that the universe has a strange sense of symmetry sometimes. Corrigan Capital Partners had structured the loan aggressively. If Voss Industrial Solutions defaulted, or if certain revenue benchmarks weren't hit within 3 years, Corrigan had the contractual right to convert their loan into a controlling equity stake and force a sale of the company. The Voss family, proud, image-obsessed, allergic to admitting weakness even to each other, had never told anyone outside Harold, Nathaniel, and the family's attorney about this arrangement. As far as Constance and Whitney knew, the company was simply going through a difficult quarter. They had no idea their entire legacy was 3 years away from potentially being sold out from under them to a private equity firm that had no sentimental attachment to the Voss name whatsoever. I sat with this information for weeks. I told no one. I want to be honest about why. Initially, it wasn't about revenge. Initially, I was simply trying to understand what I was dealing with. The affair, the family's finances, the shape of the marriage I was about to have to make a decision about. But the longer I sat with it, the more a specific, cold clarity started to form. And now I was holding information that suggested their entire world was built on far shakier ground I would never belong in their world. I made a decision that I still think was the smartest one of my professional life. I reached out, carefully and through an intermediary, to learn more about Corrigan Capital Partners itself, who ran it, what their typical exit strategy looked like when they took control of a distressed company, whether they'd be interested, eventually, in bringing in outside capital or partners once they took their equity position. What I learned was that Corrigan Capital Partners was a mid-sized opportunistic fund that had no particular interest in running an industrial manufacturing company themselves. Their business model was simple: take the equity position when companies defaulted, strip out inefficiency, and sell the improved asset within 2 to 3 years to a strategic buyer or a larger private equity fund. They weren't emotionally attached to Voss Industrial Solutions. They were attached to the return. This meant that if Voss Industrial Solutions did trigger the conversion clause, which, given the trajectory, Harold and Nathaniel had shown me through their own desperate financial manoeuvring, seemed increasingly likely, there would eventually be an opportunity for a strategic buyer with capital and industry knowledge to acquire the company from Corrigan at a value reflecting its improved operations, not its original inflated family legacy price tag. I want to describe how I actually gathered this information, because I think the mechanics matter for anyone who finds themselves in a similarly murky situation and doesn't know where to start. I didn't have access to Voss Industrial Solutions' internal financials directly. I was never invited into that world, remember, not once in 6 years. What I had was a home office drawer, a husband who'd grown careless with paperwork the way people often do when they're distracted by an affair and assume no one is paying close enough attention to notice, and my own professional training in reading financial documents that most people would find impenetrable. Over roughly 6 weekends, while Nathaniel was conveniently occupied with board prep that I now understood to mean something else entirely, I photographed, carefully, methodically, replacing every document exactly where I'd found it. Loan agreements, board meeting minutes, and correspondence between Harold and the family's longtime attorney, a cautious, aging man named Elliot Rourke, who had clearly advised against several of the more aggressive financial moves Harold had made, and had, apparently, been overruled each time. I cross-referenced what I found against public filings, industry trade publications, and conversations I had carefully with contacts in the manufacturing and logistics space who had no idea why a Bramwell executive was asking pointed questions about a competitor's contract renewal cycles. None of this, I want to be clear, involved anything illegal. I photographed documents that were physically present in my own home, accessible to me as a resident of that house, and I used publicly available industry knowledge to interpret what I found. I never accessed a password-protected system I wasn't authorized to use, never impersonated anyone, never obtained information through deception beyond the ordinary deception of a marriage that was already, unbeknownst to my husband, unraveling on both sides simultaneously. Priyanka much later reviewed everything I'd gathered specifically to confirm this, because the last thing I wanted was for any of it to be excluded from consideration on a technicality, or worse, to expose me to any liability of my own. I didn't yet have that kind of capital, not on my own. But I was about to. I want to slow down here because I think the emotional core of this story matters as much as the financial one, and I don't want you to think I processed any of this without feeling it. The night I finally confirmed the affair beyond any doubt, the overheard conversation I mentioned, which happened in our own kitchen while Nathaniel thought I was upstairs and was instead standing frozen in the hallway listening to him tell Sabrina, in a voice softer than he'd used with me in over a year, that he was figuring out the timing and that once the company stuff settles down, he'd handle things properly. I didn't confront him. I went upstairs, I sat on the edge of our bed in the dark for almost 2 hours, and I cried, not delicately, not the composed crying you see in movies, but the kind of crying that comes from somewhere much older than the specific betrayal in front of you. The crying of a 16-year-old girl who waitressed through a childhood that wasn't fair, who worked twice as hard as people who'd been handed everything, who married into a family that made her feel small at every holiday table for 6 that even the one person in that family who claimed to love her for who she was had been lying to her for the better part of a year. I let myself feel all of it that night, fully, because I've learned that grief you don't let yourself feel doesn't disappear. It just goes underground and comes out sideways later, usually at the worst possible moment. I wanted to feel it clean once so that when I acted, I could act with clarity instead of raw wound. By the next morning, something in me had settled into a different register entirely. Not colder exactly, just clearer. I remember making coffee, watching Nathaniel come downstairs already dressed for work, kiss my forehead like nothing had happened, and thinking, you have no idea what I know. You have no idea what I'm capable of building. And you were about to find out both on my timeline, not yours. I didn't file for divorce that week. I didn't tell my mother. I told exactly one person, Desmond, my business partner at Bramwell, because I needed his professional read on the Corrigan Capital situation, and because I trusted him more than I trusted anyone in the Voss family, including by that point my own husband. Desmond listened to the whole thing, the affair, the finances, the equity conversion clause, without interrupting, the way he always did in strategy meetings when someone brought him a real problem instead of a manufactured one. When I finished, he said something I've never forgotten. Elena, you've spent 6 years being underestimated by people who never once checked whether the assumption was true. That's not just an insult. In business, that's an opportunity. The most dangerous person in any negotiation is the one everyone assumes has no leverage. That conversation reshaped everything that came next. I want to add one more piece to this section because it's a detail I left out initially and I think it belongs here. About 6 weeks after I confirmed the affair, before I'd said anything to anyone besides Desmond, I ran into Sabrina Holloway by pure unplanned coincidence at a coffee shop near the courthouse where I was meeting Priyanka for what was, at that point, still a purely exploratory conversation about my legal options. Sabrina didn't recognise me. We'd never actually met in person. I only knew her face from photographs Nathaniel had never known I'd found. She was younger than I expected, maybe 29, dressed in the kind of understated, expensive-looking blazer that told you she'd grown up somewhere closer to the Voss family's world than mine. I watched her order a coffee, check her phone twice with the specific restless energy of someone waiting for a text that wasn't coming fast enough, and I remember feeling unexpectedly not rage, but something closer to a strange, weary recognition. I thought, she has no idea what she's actually stepping into. She has no idea what this family will eventually do to her, the way they specialise in making people feel like they'll never quite measure up, no matter how hard they try. I never told her that, obviously. I finished my coffee and left, but I think about that moment sometimes, because it reminded me that even the people who hurt you are often just other people navigating their own blind spots, and that understanding didn't make me forgive Nathaniel, but it did make me feel less like the singular victim of a unique cruelty and more like one point in a much longer pattern the Voss family had probably repeated, in smaller ways, for generations. Now we arrive at the Christmas I promised you at the start of this story, the one that gives it its title, and the one that, in hindsight, was the best thing the Voss family ever accidentally did for me. This was 4 months after I'd confirmed the affair. I hadn't confronted Nathaniel yet. I know that sounds like an extraordinary amount of restraint, and it was, but I want to be clear about why. I was in the middle of a delicate set of conversations with Desmond about Bramwell potentially positioning itself, eventually, as a strategic acquirer if and when Corrigan Capital Partners took its equity stake in Voss Industrial Solutions. That process needed time, and time required me to keep my personal situation stable and undisclosed on the surface, however much it cost me privately. Christmas that year was at Ashford House as always. Nathaniel and I arrived separately. He'd come from a late meeting, which by that point I understood to be a euphemism I no longer needed decoded. I arrived with a gift for Theo's care aide as a thank you and a bottle of wine I'd chosen carefully. The kind of small gesture I'd learned over 6 years the Voss family would notice and never once acknowledge. The dinner itself started normally enough, as normal as dinners in that house ever were. Constance had apparently decided that this was the year to finally address what she called school placements in front of the entire extended family. It was during dessert that the elephant in the room, meaning me. She'd had 2 glasses of wine more than usual, and something about the holiday or Nathaniel's increasingly visible distraction that night had loosened whatever restraint normally kept her cruelty at least partially veiled. I just think, she said, setting down her fork with theatrical precision, that after 6 years we should all be honest with each other. Nathaniel, darling, you married Elena when you were young and, frankly, rebelling a little against your father's expectations. We all understood that. But it's been 6 years. Don't you think it's time to consider what kind of life you actually want going forward? What kind of family you actually want? The table went quiet. I felt Nathaniel go very still beside me and, this is important, he didn't defend me. He didn't say a word. He just looked down at his plate, and in that silence I understood something with total clarity. Whatever was happening with Sabrina, whatever handling things properly meant, this family already knew, on some level, that it was coming. This wasn't a random cruel comment. This was Constance testing the water, preparing the family narrative, months before Nathaniel had even worked up the nerve to tell me himself. Whitney, never one to let a cruel moment pass without adding her own flourish, said, "It's not personal, Elena. It's just, you were a waitress. You're still essentially doing the same kind of work, just with a fancier title at some little logistics company nobody's heard of. There's nothing wrong with that. But this family has certain expectations, certain standards, and I think even you'd admit you were never really built for this world. I want you to notice something in that sentence because I certainly did. Nobody's heard of. She had no idea what Bramwell Freight had become. None of them did. They were mocking a version of my life that had stopped being true 3 years earlier, and their contempt was so total, so unquestioned, that not one of them had ever bothered to update it with a single fact. Harold, finally looking up from his plate, delivered what I now think of as the final defining line of the entire evening. He said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse, "Elena, we've always been fond of you, but perhaps it's best, for everyone's sake, if you don't come to these gatherings going forward. Some paths just aren't meant to merge permanently. I think you understand. Some paths just aren't meant to merge permanently." 6 years of marriage reduced by her own father-in-law at a Christmas dinner to 2 paths that were never supposed to touch. I stood up. I didn't cry. I'd already done my crying months earlier, in the dark, alone, where it belonged. I looked at Nathaniel, who still hadn't said a single word in my defence, and I said calmly, "Nathaniel, are you going to say anything?" He looked at his father. He looked at his mother. And then he looked at me and said quietly, "Elena, maybe we should talk about this at home. Not here." That was his answer. Not, "She's my wife and you don't get to talk about her like that." Not, "Dad, that's completely out of line." Just a plea to postpone the conflict to a more private venue, which told me everything I needed to know about whether he intended to actually fight for me at all. I remember, in that specific silence after his response, looking around the table at the rest of the family, at Constance, who had already picked her fork back up as though the matter were settled, at Whitney, who was watching me with an expression I can only describe as anticipatory, like she was waiting to see whether I'd make an undignified scene she could later describe to her friends, at the 2 younger cousins near the far end of the table, teenagers, who had the decency at least to look uncomfortable, glancing between their plates and the adults, absorbing, whether they realised it or not, an early lesson in exactly how this family handled anyone they decided didn't belong. I thought in that moment about every single dinner over 6 years, where I'd swallowed something smaller than this, told myself it wasn't worth a scene, told myself patience would eventually be rewarded with acceptance. I understood with total finality that acceptance had never actually been on offer. It had only ever been a hypothetical reward dangled just far enough out of reach to keep me compliant. I got my coat. I thanked the caterer, because the caterer, at least, had never once been unkind to me in 6 years. And I walked out of Ashford House on Christmas night, alone, into a car I'd paid for entirely with my own money, and I drove to my mother's house instead of going home. I didn't cry on that drive either. I remember very specifically feeling something closer to relief. The mask was finally completely off, and I no longer had to pretend, for anyone's comfort but my own, that I hadn't already started building the exit. I want to describe my mother's reaction that night because it's one of my favourite small moments in this entire story. I arrived at her house close to 11, still in the dress I'd worn to Ashford House, mascara, long since cried off during the drive, despite what I said earlier about not crying. I'll be honest, there was some crying in the car, just not the kind that changes anything, just the kind that releases pressure. My mother opened the door in her robe, took one look at my face, and didn't ask a single question. She just said, "Sit down, I'm making you the good hot chocolate, not the powder kind," and disappeared into the kitchen. Theo, who has a remarkable ability to sense distress in people he loves, even when he can't always articulate it verbally, came and sat beside me on the couch and put his head on my shoulder, which is his particular way of saying I know something is wrong, and I'm here anyway. I sat there, between my brother's quiet weight against my shoulder and the sound of my mother heating milk on the stove the exact way she'd done on hard nights throughout my entire childhood. And I remember thinking with total calm clarity, this is the family that actually never once made me feel like I didn't belong. Everything else was a performance I paid for with 6 years of my life, and I am done paying for it. My mother came back with the hot chocolate, sat down across from me, and finally asked gently, "Do you want to tell me what happened, or do you want to just drink this first?" I told her everything, not just that night, but the affair, the finances at Voss Industrial Solutions, all of it, in one long unbroken account that took almost 2 hours. She listened without interrupting, the way she'd listened to every hard thing I'd ever told her since I was a teenager. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I've carried with me ever since. "Elena, you spent your whole childhood being told in a dozen small ways that where we started meant something about where you could end up. I always hoped you'd prove that wrong for yourself, not for them. Don't let tonight turn into something you do for revenge instead of something you do for you." I've thought about that distinction more than almost anything else in this story. Everything that came after, the divorce, the acquisition, all of it, I tried, as much as any person honestly can, to build for myself rather than purely against them. I think mostly I succeeded. I'll let you be the judge of that by the end. I filed for divorce 11 days after that Christmas dinner, on the 2nd of January, the first business day the courts were open. I want to walk you through how I structured this, because it's the part of the story I'm proudest of. Not the dinner, not the eventual company acquisition you already know is coming, but the quiet, methodical dismantling of the assumption that I would handle this the way they expected a waitress to handle it, emotionally, hastily, without leverage. I hired an attorney named Priyanka Osei, who specialized in complex asset divorces involving family businesses, on the recommendation of Desmond's own corporate counsel. In our first meeting, I laid out everything. The affair, the timeline, the Ashford House Christmas dinner, which, as it happens, had 11 witnesses, several of whom would later be entirely willing to describe under oath exactly what Harold and Constance had said to me. Because family loyalty, I learned, evaporates remarkably quickly once people sense which direction power is actually flowing. I also laid out the equity situation at Bramwell Freight, my own separately held assets, and, carefully, because this part required real precision, what I knew about Voss Industrial Solutions' financial distress and the Corrigan Capital Partners conversion clause. Priyanka's eyes actually widened at that last part. She said, "Elena, do you understand that if this company triggers that clause during your divorce proceedings, and Nathaniel's personal net worth is tied up substantially in equity that could evaporate or convert, this changes the entire complexion of the settlement conversation?" I said, "I'm counting on it. Because here is the mechanism I want you to understand clearly. Under our state's marital property laws, assets and their appreciation during the marriage are generally subject to division. But critically, assets I had built entirely outside the marriage, held in accounts under my maiden name, funded by income and equity from a company Nathaniel and his family 3 years never once shown during any period of guilt following what I now believe was the beginning of his relationship with Sabrina agreement, though I can't prove that timing conclusively and won't claim more certainty than I have. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's assets, largely tied up in Voss Industrial Solutions equity that was actively at risk of being wiped out or diluted by the Corrigan Capital conversion clause, were about to become significantly less valuable than anyone in his family currently believed. I didn't cause that financial distress. I want to be completely clear about that, because I think it matters for the integrity of this story. The company's troubles were entirely of Harold and Nathaniel's own making, years of decisions I had no part in and no ability to influence, since I'd never once been invited into a conversation about the family business in 6 years of marriage. I simply understood the shape of the danger before anyone else in the family did, because I was the only person in that family who had spent 6 years being professionally trained to read financial distress in a company nobody else was watching closely enough. The divorce proceedings took just under 8 months. I won't detail every negotiation, but I'll tell you the shape of the outcome. Nathaniel's attorneys initially came in aggressive, clearly briefed by Harold to treat me the way the family had always treated me, as someone with limited resources and limited leverage who could be pressured into a quick, modest settlement to avoid public embarrassment. That posture lasted exactly until Priyanka's team formally disclosed, through discovery, the full extent of my Bramwell equity and the documentation I'd gathered, quietly, over months, about the Corrigan Capital loan structure. Once Nathaniel's team understood that I not only knew about the company's precarious position, but had built independent wealth entirely outside their awareness, the tone of every subsequent negotiation changed completely. Suddenly, I wasn't the waitress anymore. I was a party who could afford to walk away from any settlement offer that didn't reflect the actual value of 6 years I'd contributed to that marriage. 6 years during which, I should mention, I had also quietly funded several joint expenses, covered mortgage gaps during 2 of Nathaniel's cash flow tight quarters, using my own income, expecting nothing in return except, apparently, to eventually be told my path wasn't meant to merge permanently with theirs. The final settlement was substantial, not because I sought to punish Nathaniel financially beyond what was fair, but because fair, once properly calculated with full financial transparency, was a number the Voss family had never once imagined I understood well enough to demand. I want to describe one specific negotiation session, because I think it crystallizes the entire shift in power better than any summary could. It happened around month 5 of the proceedings, in a conference room at Priyanka's firm. a deliberate choice on our part, since meeting on our own territory rather than a neutral location sends its own quiet signal in negotiations like this. Nathaniel's lead attorney, a sharp, aggressive man named Corbin Reyes, who I later learned had been specifically selected by Harold for his reputation of protecting family legacies, opened the session by suggesting that given the relatively short duration of the marriage and Mrs. Voss's independent means, a modest settlement focused primarily on the marital home would be the most efficient path forward for everyone. Priyanka let him finish completely before responding, which I'd learned by then was one of her signature tactics. Never interrupt an opponent who's busy building a version of the story that Discovery is about to demolish. Then she slid across the table a folder containing, among other things, a detailed accounting of 6 years of financial contributions I'd made to joint expenses, using my own separately held income, a breakdown of the mortgage gaps I'd covered during 2 specific quarters when Nathaniel's own cash flow had tightened due to Voss Industrial Solutions' declining contracts, and a formal valuation of my Bramwell equity stake prepared by an independent forensic accountant. I watched Corbin Reyes' expression change while he read through it, page by page, and I watched Nathaniel seated beside him go visibly pale about halfway through, because I don't think he'd ever been told by anyone on his own legal team the actual scale of what I'd built or contributed. Harold, notably, was not in that room. By that point, 5 months into the proceedings, he'd stopped attending sessions personally, delegating everything to Nathaniel's attorneys, which I choose to interpret as an early sign that he already sensed on some level that the ground beneath his family certainty was no longer as solid as it used to be. We're prepared to litigate this fully, including full public disclosure of Voss Industrial Solutions' financial position as it relates to marital asset valuation, if that's the path your client prefers. Or we can discuss a settlement that actually reflects 6 years of documented contribution. Your call, Corbin. They asked for a 2-week continuance to reassess. When we returned to the table, the tone of every subsequent conversation had fundamentally changed. Here is where the 2 threads of this story, the marriage and the business, finally converge. 14 months after my divorce finalised, Voss Industrial Solutions missed the final revenue benchmark specified in its agreement with Corrigan Capital Partners. I learned this not through any inside channel, but through public filings and industry trade press, because by that point I had positioned Bramwell Freight, now under my strategic direction as Director of Growth Strategy and a 12% equity holder, pushing for exactly this kind of expansion, to actively monitor the industrial logistics and manufacturing space for exactly this kind of distressed opportunity. Corrigan Capital Partners exercised their conversion clause. Harold Voss, 71 years old, and having built his identity for 4 decades around being the man who ran Voss Industrial Solutions, lost majority control of the company his own father had founded in a single legal maneuver that took less time to execute than most weddings take to plan. Nathaniel, who had been groomed for years to eventually inherit the CEO title, found himself at 36 a minority shareholder in a company now controlled by a private equity fund with no interest in keeping any Voss family member in a leadership role beyond a brief, face-saving transition period. I felt something when I read that news. I won't pretend I felt nothing. But it wasn't triumph exactly. It was closer to a strange, quiet symmetry settling into place. The sense of watching a structure that had once made me feel small simply fail to hold its own weight, entirely on its own terms, without me having lifted a finger to knock it over. What I did next, though, was very much me lifting a finger. Corrigan Capital Partners, as I'd anticipated over a year earlier, had no long-term interest in operating an industrial manufacturing and logistics company themselves. Their model was improvement and exit. Within 8 months of taking control, they began quietly shopping the improved, restructured Voss Industrial Solutions, now leaner, its inefficiencies stripped out by Corrigan's own operational team, its remaining contracts stabilised, to strategic buyers who could offer both capital and industry synergy. Bramwell Freight, by this point a genuinely significant regional logistics operation with expanding manufacturing adjacent contracts, was exactly the kind of strategic buyer Corrigan wanted. Desmond, who had watched this entire situation unfold alongside me for over a year, with a kind of quiet, delighted patience, brought the acquisition proposal to Bramwell's board himself, though everyone in that room, including Desmond, understood whose vision and whose relentless monitoring of the Corrigan situation had made the opportunity possible in the first place. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. I did not personally engineer Voss Industrial Solutions' downfall. I didn't sabotage a single contract, leak a single piece of confidential information to a competitor, or take any action that damaged the company beyond simply understanding, earlier and more clearly than anyone inside the family, exactly how fragile their financial position already was. Everything that happened to that company happened because of decisions Harold and Nathaniel made years before I ever knew the full details existed. What I did was refuse to look away from an opportunity simply because acting on it would eventually place me on the opposite side of a negotiating table from people who had once told me my path could never merge with theirs. I want to walk through the mechanics of how that acquisition actually came together, because I think the specific process matters, and because I want to be honest that it wasn't a single dramatic moment, but a long, careful sequence of ordinary business decisions that happened to accumulate into something extraordinary. The first real signal came about 4 months after Corrigan Capital Partners took control, when one of their transition executives, a woman named Fiona Kessler, whom I'd later come to respect a great deal in the negotiations that followed, reached out to several regional logistics and manufacturing firms with a standard, unemotional market practice inquiry. For funds like Corrigan, was their interest they test the market valuation long before any formal sale process partnership with the restructured Voss Industrial Solutions. Bramwell was on that initial outreach list not because of any special insight I'd provided it, but simply because Bramwell had, by that point, become genuinely well known in the regional logistics space. A fact that still occasionally startles me when I think about how far the company had come from the 40-person operation I joined years earlier. Desmond brought the inquiry to me directly, half as a formality and half, I think, already sensing there was more history here than I'd fully disclosed even to him. I told him everything at that point, the full history with the Voss family, the Christmas dinner, all of it. I remember he sat back in his chair, was quiet for a long moment, and then said, "Elena, I need to ask you directly, and I need an honest answer. Can you evaluate this acquisition opportunity objectively, or is there too much personal history here for you to lead it?" It was a fair question, and I took real time to answer it honestly rather than defensively. I told him, the financial case for the acquisition would stand entirely on its own merits regardless of my history with the Voss family. The market data, the synergy between Bramwell's logistics network and Voss Industrial Solutions manufacturing contracts, the pricing Corrigan was likely to accept given their fund's typical exit timeline, all of it pointed toward a genuinely sound strategic deal, independent of any personal feeling I carried into the room. But I also told him honestly that I wanted to lead it. Not out of revenge, though I won't pretend that motivation was entirely absent, but because I understood that company, its client relationships, its operational weaknesses, and its remaining institutional knowledge better than almost anyone else Bramwell could have assigned to the deal, precisely because of the years I'd spent, unknowingly at the time, absorbing details about it during family conversations I'd been present for but never included in. Desmond agreed, on the condition that Bramwell's outside counsel review every stage of the negotiation to ensure there was no appearance of impropriety, given my personal history, a reasonable professional safeguard that I supported completely, because the last thing I wanted was for this acquisition's legitimacy to ever be questioned on the basis of old grievances rather than sound business logic. The due diligence process took nearly 5 months. I spent a significant portion of it reviewing financial documents that, in a strange, almost surreal turn, were now being formally disclosed to me by Corrigan's own team, documents detailing exactly the kind of structural weaknesses I'd first glimpsed, unofficially and privately, in a home office drawer years earlier. There was something almost meditative about seeing, confirmed in official audited form, everything I'd once had to piece together secretly, alone at my kitchen table at midnight, while a marriage quietly fell apart around me. Fiona Kessler, negotiating on Corrigan's behalf, was sharp, fair, and entirely unsentimental about the Voss family name. Exactly the kind of counterpart you want in a deal like this, because sentiment on either side tends to produce worse outcomes than clear-eyed calculation. We settled on a valuation after 3 rounds of negotiation, reflecting the company's genuinely improved operational efficiency under Corrigan's restructuring, but appropriately discounted for the customer concentration risk that had caused the original crisis in the first place. The acquisition closed 11 months after Corrigan took control, at a price reflecting the company's improved but still modest post-restructuring value. A fraction of what Harold Voss would have told you at any Christmas dinner over the previous decade. His family's legacy company was truly worth. Bramwell Freight, the little logistics company nobody's heard of, the company Whitney had dismissed at that Christmas table without knowing a single relevant fact about it, became the majority owner of Voss Industrial Solutions. And I, Elena Marsh, Director of Growth Strategy, and now, following the acquisition, Chief Operating Officer of the combined entity, walked into Ashford House's associated corporate offices for the first integration meeting with the remaining Voss family executives still employed there, in a position of formal authority over the very company that had once informed me, over dessert, that some paths simply weren't meant to merge permanently. I want to describe this meeting carefully, because I think it's the moment people listening to this story have been waiting for, and I don't want to inflate it into something more theatrical than it actually was. The most satisfying moments in real life, I've learned, are rarely loud. They're quiet, precise, and almost unbearably calm. Harold Voss was no longer CEO. Corrigan's restructuring had removed him from that role over a year earlier, retaining him only in a diminished advisory capacity as part of the transition terms, largely, I suspect, because removing him entirely would have created unnecessary friction with legacy clients who still associated the family name with reliability. Nathaniel had stayed on in a mid-level operations role, one significantly smaller than the leadership position he'd once been groomed to inherit, because, and I want to say this plainly, after the divorce and after the company's collapse, he genuinely had very few other options that matched his experience, and to my knowledge, he took the diminished role out of necessity rather than any remaining loyalty to a family legacy that had already largely dissolved around him. I walked into that integration meeting with Desmond and two other members of Bramwell's executive team. Harold was seated at the far end of the conference table, not the head notably. That seat had already been claimed, without comment, by one of Corrigan's own transition executives months earlier. A small detail that told you everything about how thoroughly his authority had already eroded before I even arrived. Nathaniel sat 2 seats down from him, visibly startled when I walked in, though he recovered his composure faster than I expected. Whitney was not present. Her marketing role had been eliminated in the restructuring 8 months prior, a fact I learned only in passing, and felt, I'll admit, a small and probably ungenerous flicker of satisfaction about. Harold was the one who spoke first, and I give him credit for at least attempting to hold onto some shred of the old dynamic. He said, "Elena, I have to say this is quite a turn of events." I said, "It is. Thank you for making time today, Harold. I know this transition period has been difficult for everyone." I meant it genuinely when I said that, not as a performance of graciousness, but because I had learned through my own experience of loss and humiliation that watching your entire sense of identity collapse in public is a genuinely difficult thing to survive, regardless of who it happens to or whether they once deserved a measure of humility they never showed you. Nathaniel didn't say much during that meeting. Near the end, as everyone was gathering their materials, he approached me quietly and said, "I should have said something, that Christmas. I've thought about it more times than you probably think I have." I said, "I know you have, Nathaniel. I'm not here to punish you for that. I'm here because Bramwell made a sound strategic acquisition, and I happen to be the person best positioned to run the integration." And that was true. It was also true that some part of me needed him to hear, once, directly, that the outcome of that Christmas dinner had nothing to do with luck or timing or the family's misfortune. It had everything to do with the fact that they had spent 6 years underestimating a woman who had never once stopped building, quietly, in rooms they never bothered to look into. I didn't gloat. I want to be clear about that, because I think gloating would have cheapened everything I'd actually accomplished. I ran the meeting the way I run every meeting, carefully, professionally, focused on integration timelines and retained client relationships rather than old grievances. There was one more exchange in that meeting I want to describe, because it's the moment that actually stayed with me longest, more than the acquisition itself. Near the end, as people were filing out, Harold lingered by the door, and for a moment I thought he might simply leave without saying anything further. Instead, he turned back and said quietly, in a voice that had none of the performative authority he'd always carried at that Ashford House dinner table, "You built all of this without a single dollar of this family's money. I didn't think that was possible for someone who started where you did." I said, That's exactly the problem, Harold. You never thought it was possible, not because it wasn't, but because you never once checked. He didn't have a response to that. He just nodded, slowly, the particular nod of a man recalibrating decades of assumptions in real time, and left. I don't know if that moment changed anything meaningful in how he sees the world. People rarely have complete reckonings in a single conversation, and I'm skeptical of stories that suggest otherwise. But I know it changed something in me, some last small knot of tension I'd been carrying since that Christmas dinner, because I finally had, on the record, from the man who told me my path could never merge with theirs, an open acknowledgement that his certainty had simply been wrong. I will admit, walking out of that building afterward, into a car that was now several times over, whose character had already been tested, had ever assumed I was capable of in exactly the kind of ordinary, unglamorous circumstances where a person's true nature is hardest to fake. I think stories like this owe their listeners an honest accounting of where everyone ended up rather than a tidy bow tied around the ending. So let me tell you where things actually stand now, 3 years after that Christmas dinner. Harold Voss retired from his advisory role at Voss Industrial Solutions, roughly a year after the acquisition, quietly, without the kind of retirement gala a man of his former stature might once have expected. I understand through mutual industry contacts rather than any personal relationship that he spends most of his time now at Ashford House, which the family kept, one of the few assets that survived the restructuring largely intact, since it had never been collateralized against the business loans. I feel, honestly, very little about Harold's fate one way or the other. He made his choices at that dinner table and for decades before it, and the consequences that followed were the predictable result of financial decisions that had nothing to do with me. Constance, I'm told, has become significantly quieter at family gatherings since the company's restructuring became public knowledge in local business circles. There is apparently a particular kind of social discomfort that comes from having spent years positioning your family's wealth and status as the defining feature of your worth, only to watch that wealth become substantially smaller in front of the same social circle you once used it to look down on. I don't say this with cruelty, I say it because I think it's an important, almost universal lesson. Contempt built entirely on the foundation of what you currently have, rather than who you actually are, is always one bad quarter away from collapsing. Whitney, after her marketing role was eliminated, took nearly a year to find comparable work, eventually landing a position at a much smaller firm, at a level below where she'd started at Voss Industrial Solutions. I've heard secondhand that she's actually quite good at the work, when she's not performing superiority for an audience that used to include people like me. I hope that's true. I don't wish her ongoing failure. I simply no longer have any interest in her opinion of my worth. Nathaniel and I are, at this point, cordial in the specific, careful way that divorced people whose lives remain professionally intertwined sometimes manage to be. He still works in an operations role at the combined company, a role I did not eliminate, despite having the authority to, because he is, when stripped of his family's expectations and his own cowardice at that dinner table, actually reasonably competent at his job. And I've never believed in confusing personal history with professional fairness. We don't discuss the marriage. We don't discuss the affair, or Sabrina, who I understand did not stay with him long after the divorce finalised, though I genuinely don't know the details and have no particular desire to learn them. Desmond and I eventually became full co-owners of the combined Bramwell-Voss entity, which we rebranded 18 months ago as Marsh Okafor Industrial, a name that, I'll admit, gives me a specific kind of satisfaction every time I see it on a building, a truck or a contract, precisely because it contains my name in full, on a legacy the Voss family once told me I would never be permitted to touch. My mother and Theo still live in the house I bought them, which I have since paid off entirely. Theo, now in a stable, well-supported living arrangement, funded comfortably by my own success rather than anyone's charity, is, by every measure that actually matters, thriving. He's taken up woodworking over the past 2 years, of all things, and has started selling small handmade pieces, cutting boards, simple shelves at a local market on weekends. And I have never seen him prouder of anything than the first time a stranger paid him actual money for something he'd built with his own hands. I think about that a great deal. Actually, the parallel between his pride in that small, hard-won achievement and my own, scaled up considerably, but rooted in exactly the same feeling. The specific satisfaction of being valued for something you built yourself rather than something you were simply given. My mother, who worked double shifts her entire life so that I could have the luxury of a different path, a phrase I've reclaimed entirely for myself now, stripped of the condescension it once carried finally, at 60 in, doesn't work double shifts anymore because she doesn't have to. She still, out of habit more than necessity, occasionally picks up a few shifts at the hospital where she spent 30 years. Not because we need the income, but because, as she told me once, some kinds of work give you a sense of purpose that money alone doesn't replace. Even though it took me a while to understand it, because I think for years I equated escaping hardship entirely with success, when really the goal was always just having the choice. I should also mention Priyanka, my divorce attorney, because she became something more than a hired professional over the course of those 8 months. She became, genuinely, a friend, and remains one of the people I trust most with difficult decisions even now. We still have dinner every few months, and she jokes that my case remains one of the most satisfying wins of her career, not because of the settlement size, though that certainly helped her firm's reputation, but because, in her words, it's rare to represent a client who was underestimated that completely and watch every single assumption about her get dismantled with actual evidence instead of just righteous anger. I've held on to that description of myself more than almost anything else anyone said to me during that entire period, because I think it's the most accurate summary of the whole story. Not a woman who got angry and lucky, but a woman who got clear and patient and built her case the way she'd built everything else in her life, brick by brick, with documentation, refusing to let anyone rush her into acting before she was actually ready. I don't think this story is really about revenge, even though I understand why it might read that way, and even though I won't pretend there isn't some satisfaction in how it ended. I think it's about something slightly different and slightly more useful, if you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life in it. The Voss family's fundamental mistake wasn't cruelty, though there was plenty of that. Their fundamental mistake was certainty, the specific, dangerous certainty that comes from never once questioning your own assumptions about a person, because questioning them might require acknowledging that your comfortable hierarchy of worth was built on nothing sturdier than inherited luck and other people's silence. I was never just a waitress. I was a woman who understood, from an early age, exactly what it costs to build something with your own hands when nobody hands you a head start. That understanding, that specific discipline forged by necessity rather than privilege, turned out to be worth considerably more, in the end, than anything Harold Voss ever inherited. If you're in a room right now where someone is measuring your worth by where you started instead of where you're capable of going, I want you to hear this clearly. Their certainty about your limitations says everything about their imagination and absolutely nothing about your ceiling. Keep building, quietly if you need to, loudly if you're ready to. Keep the receipts. Keep your own accounts separate, literally and figuratively, and when the moment comes, and in my experience it eventually does, to show people exactly how wrong their certainty was, do it the way that actually satisfies you in the long run. Not with rage, but with results so undeniable that no dinner table conversation could ever shrink them back down again. I also want to say something to anyone listening who is currently in the waiting phase of a story like this, the phase I spent months in, knowing something was deeply wrong in my marriage, knowing something valuable was quietly building in my professional life, but not yet ready to act on either. That phase is not weakness. I used to feel embarrassed, looking back, about how long I waited to confront Nathaniel, how long I sat on information about the family's finances before doing anything with it. I've come to believe that embarrassment was misplaced. Waiting, when you're using that time to gather clarity, rather than simply avoiding pain, is not the same as being passive. There is a real difference between freezing out of fear and pausing deliberately to build a foundation sturdy enough to hold the weight of what comes next. I was doing the second thing, even when it felt, some days, indistinguishable from the first. I want to say one more thing, specifically to anyone listening who has ever been told, explicitly or through 1,000 small gestures, that they don't belong somewhere, a family, an industry, a social circle, a certain kind of success. The Voss family's cruelty toward me was never really about waitressing, just like it was never really about wine pairings or designer dresses, or which fork to use first. It was about a family's need to locate their own worth in comparison to someone else's supposed lack of it. That need is common. You will encounter versions of it your entire life, in workplaces, in friendships, sometimes even in your own family of origin. The specific lesson I'd ask you to take from this isn't, get revenge. It's simpler than that, and I think more durable. Stop asking people who have already shown you their contempt to eventually recognize your worth. Go build the kind of undeniable evidence of your own value that makes their recognition, when and if it finally arrives, almost beside the point. I think about Harold's face in that final meeting more than I expected to, if I'm honest with you. Not with cruelty. With something closer to a strange, quiet compassion for a man who spent his entire life building his identity around a hierarchy that, in the end, simply couldn't survive contact with reality. I don't think Harold Voss is uniquely villainous. I think he's a fairly ordinary man who was handed enormous advantages early in life and never once had to develop the muscle of questioning whether those advantages made him inherently better than people who didn't have them. A lot of people like that exist in the world. Most of them never face a moment that forces the question. Harold did, eventually, mostly by his own family's financial mismanagement rather than anything I orchestrated directly. And I think, on some level, that reckoning was probably overdue regardless of whether I'd ever entered his family's life at all. I walked out of Ashford House on a Christmas night 3 years ago with nothing but a coat, a car I'd paid for myself, and the quiet, growing certainty that I would never again let anyone's contempt define the size of the life I was allowed to build. 3 years later, I own the building where that contempt was headquartered. Some paths, it turns out, weren't meant to merge permanently after all. They were just never supposed to run in the direction Harold Voss assumed they would. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been underestimated by people who never once bothered to check whether their assumptions were true, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below.